So my concern is if the argument is psilocybin should be decriminalized because it's relatively harmless and it even has some benefit, then we'll never get to the point where we can also decriminalize cocaine or heroin, because the argument will be clearly they're dangerous and addictive and therefore should remain criminal. No, we should decriminalize all drugs because treating people who are using drugs like criminals doesn't help them. That does nothing but punish them for a problem for which they're already punished.
Hello, dear ones. Welcome back to Unbroken Chain. This is Maura James, and that is Peter Hendricks, who is a clinical psychologist and assistant professor at UAB here in Birmingham that I got to have a conversation with recently about a study that he's been running now for several years on psilocybin-facilitated psychotherapy for cocaine dependence, which means treating addiction with magic mushrooms. And I was obviously curious to talk to somebody who's doing that work here in the South, but also just more generally, I think as many of you that have been listening to this podcast now know, I am really anxious for change and for healing for our communities, for this country. And at times that's made me wary of the clinical medicalized path for psychedelics. And the more I open myself to talking to people who are walking that path, the more I realize that as eager as I am for change, I'm eager for sustainable change. And I honor the people that are working on their part of that equation in all kinds of sectors. And I know that what is moving the needle currently with decriminalization and legalization in this country is science. In addition to capitalism, I know that science and data and money are all part of shifting policy. And as much as we as individuals and communities need to take back culture, I know we also have to take back government and create systems that also work for us there too. And so I'm really grateful to people like Peter who are trying to figure out how to do that in a way where these discoveries of real medicine and real healing can be supported long term. This conversation is also really near and dear to my heart because as I've spoken about in the past, I used to have a really fraught relationship with alcohol for a lot of my 20s. It was definitely a coping mechanism, and there was a period where I couldn't drink without blacking out, and I couldn't go to social settings without drinking, and I felt really trapped and really ashamed. And ayahuasca totally changed my life in many ways, but my relationship to alcohol was a big one. I'm not sober now. I have a drink every now and then. But plant medicines totally addressed the part of myself that felt broken or inadequate, that didn't know how to be, honestly, in social settings because I didn't know who I was, didn't like who I was, didn't feel confident enough that whatever came out of me in the moment would be acceptable, interesting, valuable to the world. So now when I do drink, it's like 1 or 2 drinks on a special occasion to be a little silly. I'm going into it with a very clear understanding that more than 2 drinks of alcohol will not take me where I want to go. And I understand that in a really deep somatic way that extends far beyond that moment of like holding the drink in my hand and weighing the pros and cons. It's more like I've just lost my taste for it. I've lost my attraction to it, my desire for it. I just have a tremendous amount of confidence and faith in who I am, and that if I don't feel great about who I am, I have so many more tools to investigate why and to go into those wounds and to love on them rather than trying to cover them up with a false sense of confidence or flirtation, whatever it may be. If I do want to alter my consciousness recreationally, including in social settings, cannabis is something that can actually take me into my heart space and allow me to be more present with what's going on. Learning to navigate the psychedelic experience has built up a muscle where that feels good to me, to be present with what is, even when it's uncomfortable or unexpected. I don't have to run away from what's really happening, which is what alcohol certainly helped me do. It was a short-term relief for a long-term problem. And I don't want to imply that psychedelics are a silver bullet for addiction, because they're not. They're not a silver bullet for anything. But what they did do was invite me into the work that I needed to do. It created a pathway where I could create a relationship to myself and to my thoughts. Whereas when I was in the throes of drinking, I felt completely out of control. There was no separation between who I was and the part of my psyche and soul that was just like lusting after fun and escape and being anywhere but with myself, because it felt so bad. So Peter says in this conversation that he's not a revolutionary, and I appreciate that he is protecting the scientific container that holds his research and his approach. But I also want to argue that advocating for the place of plant medicine in a field that has been dominated by pharmaceuticals, which, as we know, is heavily driven by capitalism, often over people, really helping people, is actually revolutionary and has the potential to change lives on a pretty radical scale. So even if he's not going to accept a responsibility for that, I just want to give him major props for the work that he's doing and for a lot of the sentiments that he expresses in this conversation, which are pretty radical, certainly for the dominant culture here in the South, but really much more broadly for the current state of our institutions, be that healthcare, criminal justice, and education. So I'm grateful to him for being as honest and open as he was. And I think this conversation really opens into a really beautiful way. He ended up asking me a lot of questions about some of my experiences, especially as they tied into his research. So come on in. I'm really glad you're here. This is Peter Hendricks.
My name is Peter Hendricks. I'm a clinical psychologist and associate professor at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and I'm conducting a study on psilocybin-facilitated psychotherapy for cocaine dependence.
Wow. How did that come to be?
Well, it's a long story. I'll try to give the short version here. I've had an interest in psilocybin for a while. Roland Griffith's now landmark 2006 study was published in a journal called Psychopharmacology. My dissertation happened to be published in the same issue of that journal. And when I was a postdoctoral fellow at UCSF, this is San Francisco, I received a complimentary copy of that journal. And it was, a hard copy in a plastic wrap. And I tore the plastic wrap off the journal and opened the issue thinking that even though I was opening this randomly, that it would open to my article, because that's how the universe works. And by the way, my article was on the early time course of smoking withdrawal effects. Nothing quite as interesting as psilocybin in healthy volunteers, but it opened instead to Roland's article on the effects of psilocybin in healthy volunteers. And I was fascinated by this. And, I should say that my own background, perhaps not unique, but it might explain why I do have an interest in these substances. So my mother is now retired, but she was a theologian when she was working. She was raised in very rural North Carolina. She was raised Southern Baptist. She became Catholic. She went to a Catholic seminary school. Whoa. She got a degree in theology and ethics. She taught at a Catholic school. She wrote her thesis on, I think the title was a Catholic feminist view of abortion. So she was deeply involved in bioethics, very smart woman. And she raised me in a very unique faith community. When I graduated from college, I was in a volunteer organization called the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, which is, it's a faith-based volunteer organization. And I just say this because my own background is, as a person of faith, I have a personal understanding of how one's view of the sacred or transcendent can be the ultimate driver of their behavior. Why do I do what I do? Because of these deeply held beliefs that I have about my transcendent purpose. And when I came across this article, now keep in mind I'm a child of the 80s from the DC area, so it's a very political area. And at the height of the Just Say No campaign and Reagan's administration, the assumption was if there are a group of substances on a list, we might call these Class 1 controlled substances or Schedule 1 controlled substances, we might assume, as the government says, they're dangerous and addictive. And that was my assumption. And, really quite amazingly, I had gone through graduate school, focused on addiction or treatment of addiction, without ever learning of the earlier work primarily with LSD. Right? This being after Albert Hofmann's discovery of LSD in 1943 and through the early 70s. There was a tremendous amount of research focused mostly on LSD, but you really don't learn about that. I mean, that research has been really swept under the rug. So to come across this article suggesting that there is a drug molecule that can occasion the type of experience that the saints and sages across world religions have written about for centuries was incredible to me. And, the application to a variety of mental health conditions was obvious to me then, as it was to those early scientists in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and I should say to the elder traditions dating back before recorded history. So whether we're talking about indigenous Amazonians who work with ayahuasca or the Native American church and the peyote traditions and others, it's clear that humans have grasped for a long time that these substances, these medicines, can have very powerful impacts and may very well be therapeutic. So, it's kind of ironic that scientists would say that we've discovered them, we're learning about them. Well, I mean, in reality, you might say that we're rediscovering them, we're reacquainting ourselves with them. These elder traditions probably already know the answers to the questions we're asking, but we are working within this framework, within this Western science framework, and within a regulatory framework that requires that we conduct the sort of studies we conduct so that we can make this treatment, if our hypotheses are supported, if it's safe and effective, we can make them widely available to people who may not otherwise make use of these treatments if their only option was to receive ayahuasca in an ayahuasca ceremony in South America or, in an underground sort of ceremony that's technically illegal, that is illegal in the United States. So it made sense to me at the time that there could be a medical application of these substances, in part because, like I said, I come from this background, a spiritual background, realizing that really meaningful spiritual experiences can motivate behavior, perhaps more than anything. Like, why do we ultimately do what we do? Because we have some sense of our transcendent sacred purpose, and that varies from person to person. So that's how I became involved. And now this was back in 2006 when I first saw this article. And at the time I was a postdoc, and I wasn't in a position to say, hey, let's launch a psilocybin project here. But I joined the faculty here in 2010. So we have here at UAB a program called TASK, which is a community corrections diversion program. It stands for Treatment Alternatives for Safer Communities. So this is for people with substance involvement. So rather than being incarcerated, these are people who are sent to drug counseling, assigned a social worker, are provided with a number of services, are required to submit urine drug screens, and if they do as they're expected, and if they provide clean urine drug screens, then they successfully complete task, and they don't need to be concerned about incarceration. We had data on more than 25,000 participants of task. Whoa. And it just so happened that these caseworkers ask participants about their drug use at intake. And the question was, is there an association between hallucinogen use and outcome in this program? And at the time I wasn't sure what I'd find, because now we're talking about naturalistic use outside of an intentional sort of therapeutic context. Some could have simply been using these substances for recreational purposes, without any intention of learning, healing, whatever it might be. But we found that there was this association between hallucinogen use, broadly speaking, which would include MDMA and ketamine, PCP. Most hallucinogen, so I'm using air quotation marks here. Most hallucinogens, or most hallucinogen use, is accounted for by LSD and psilocybin in the United States. But MDMA would be in that category as well. But in any event, there was an association where hallucinogen use was associated with a decreased likelihood of recidivism, whereas use of virtually every other illicit substance was associated with an increased likelihood of that outcome. So that really surprised us, and it was consistent with a line of work coming from not only Hopkins, but NYU and Charlie Grobe at UCLA and elsewhere. So that really piqued our interest, and from that point we decided to pursue a line of work where we would see if we could address cocaine dependence. There are many reasons for that. One, in our data set, cocaine use is of all illicit substance use most strongly associated with recidivism. Right? It's a major stimulant, so that means it gets you up and going. So unlike some drugs like, say, cannabis, marijuana, or opiates that might be somewhat sedating, this is a drug that has you up and moving. And I think when you're up and moving and not thinking clearly, you're more likely to be making bad decisions. And major stimulant use is strongly tied to impulsive, risky behavior. So, our thought was, hey, if we can address cocaine dependence, then there's an obvious application to the criminal justice system. But also, there is no approved pharmacotherapy for cocaine dependence. There is for virtually every other substance use disorder.
Why is that?
We just haven't found anything.
Wow.
I mean, we've tested dozens of medications for cocaine dependence, and nothing really works. So we're in need of something, and if we were to show some evidence of efficacy, then it could be psilocybin could really be the first medication that would be indicated for cocaine dependence, which would be really exciting. And obviously there are a lot of people who are using cocaine and need help, and this could be just one of those therapies that could be helpful.
Wow.
So hopefully, I don't know if I've answered the question. I've even forgotten what the question was. I ramble.
The context is really helpful, actually. I'm really grateful that you spoke about that, because I think, like, when I found psychedelic medicines in my personal life and was like talking to my parents and their contemporaries, I definitely felt the backlash of like, oh, we saw the 60s, we know what that's all about, that doesn't work. And I'm really grateful that I feel like as there's a resurgence now, and I feel like it's being handled maybe with a different kind of responsibility than it was during those times, but there's also like an honoring of this very concrete clinical lineage that existed for a long time.
Yeah, I think I often think about this now, late 60s, pretty radical time. I think there are a lot of changes, very dramatic changes that, perhaps were taking place too quickly for not only the politicians of the time to handle, but maybe most mainstream American culture. And we probably lost our appreciation of that, because many of the ideas that I guess originated with that initial countercultural movement are fairly mainstream now. Whether it's art that we might call psychedelic or music that we might call psychedelic. But I think about this often. I've talked to my mother about this. She was born in 1945. At one point, Elvis shaking his hips on TV was really pretty scandalous. And you just think of how music changed during that time. One of my favorite bands, like many, would be the Beatles. I mean, just listen to their music and how it seems to take a big change right around Rubber Soul or Revolver to Sgt. Pepper's. I mean, it's very obvious when they start experimenting with psychedelics themselves. It has a very clear impact on their music, and, in my opinion, for the better. But that sort of change must have been revolutionary, if not shocking at the time. For another band I'm fond of, the Grateful Dead, I can only imagine what a 20-minute jam would have been like at the time. I mean, just unheard of, because most of the songs on the radio were 2 minutes in length. Buddy Holly was about as sensational as they came, or Elvis on TV, and now you've got bands that are improvising for 20 minutes at a time. I mean, these are radical changes. Not only that, men are growing out their hair. They're wearing vastly different sort of clothing than anyone would have seen before. Women are burning their bras or growing body hair. I mean, there must have been a lot of shocking changes at the time that were a little bit too much to handle. And I think really, what's at the core of the psychedelic experience is this insight that we're all one. All is one, everything's interconnected, and we're all in this together. And I think it probably scared Nixon to think an entire generation would say, we're not going to Vietnam to kill our fellow people. And also, we're not devoting our lives to the acquisition of wealth at the expense of our fellow people. We're going to go live off on a commune and just live in harmony with nature. Now, I guess if I'm trying to be charitable to Nixon and to others, if everybody had decided to go and live on a commune and stop buying things, we probably would have seen some sort of collapse of society, because capitalism does require that we all be buying, putting money into the economy. And if everyone stopped suddenly, that would be bad. And I could see, well,
for the economy.
the economy, and we'd probably figure things out. But in the short term, it might be, frightening to some. I could see how Nixon and others would have been kind of frightened at all these changes. They were just too much, too soon. And unfortunately, many of the scientists at the time, like Leary, though unbelievably brilliant. If I only had the IQ of Timothy Leary, he was unbelievably brilliant. And, more than anyone, he had this insight that the psychedelic experience was a mystical type religious epiphany. No one else had that insight. Most had sort of couched the experience in the psychodynamic language at the time. I'm trained as a behaviorist. That psychodynamic language doesn't make any sense to me. He was the first to say, "No, this is like a religious experience," and to write a book, a guide that's based in part of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is unbelievably creative. And he was charismatic and like an Irish storyteller, really impressive person, but he really wasn't doing a whole lot of science. And I think his thought was, this is more important than science, right? I can change the world. If everyone has an experience in which we realize all is one, there's no limit to the problems that we might solve. And I don't blame him for feeling that way, for thinking, hey, I'm not even going to bother with this science thing anymore. But I think he also seemed to really like media attention, and no one's perfect. His antics didn't help. And combined with these really dramatic and sudden changes that were taking place, it was too much for people to handle. The thing is, though, many of the people who were there, who were part of that revolution, or at least were there to witness it, are still with us today. And a lot of the ideas that were revolutionary at the time, I think, have been integrated into our society. And now these ideas that are returning, hey, we might be able to treat mental health conditions with these psychedelic substances, don't seem crazy, as they may have at the time. And the sort of experiences that people have with psilocybin or LSD or ayahuasca, DMT, in some ways you might say they've been domesticated. They're not so foreign and strange. We're somewhat familiar with this. We have psychedelic art and imagery and music. So I don't think people are as uncomfortable with that. But not only that, those of us who are doing this work, no one is calling for a revolution. That's not really what we do. We're only saying that, hey, these substances might have a place in medicine. They might have a place in psychology and psychiatry, and we'd like to help people. And it's as simple as that. We're trying to do the science that we do so that we can help as many people as we can help. And I think that is a bipartisan, apolitical issue. Everyone's been impacted by depression. You think of application of psychedelics to end-of-life distress. I mean, sooner or later, we're all going to be looking at our own mortality. We've probably all at least known someone or loved someone who's really struggled with addiction. So if our perspective is we're trying to help people who are going through these experiences, I don't know that anybody would really be opposed to what we're doing, especially since we're doing this in a careful and objective manner. Yeah.
Well, I would love to hear sort of your take on what addiction really is about, because my sense is that it's connected to what you're talking about, this mystical experience of oneness that most of us do not experience in culture as it exists in the West today, and that a lot of the brokenness that people are experiencing stems from that. But I'd be curious what your take as a scientist is on how addiction works.
Wow, that's a great question. Well, there are a number of ways of answering that question. I think, in a very basic sense, I mean, the word addiction, it stems from a Latin term. It means to be slave to something. Ooh. Right? And I think at the core of addiction is this realization that I am compelled to do something that I realize is really bad for me. I really wish I could stop doing this thing. I've tried and I can't. I've tried and I've tried and I've tried and I can't stop, even though I realize it's ruining my life. That's really at the core of addiction, being compelled to do something you realize is not good for you. Now, I think at the neurological level, you have a hyperactive, I should say, limbic system. So this part of our brain that responds to biologically meaningful rewards. That part of our brain that lights up when we eat, right? So I'm hungry, I eat, that's pleasurable, there's my limbic system lighting up. That same, part of our brain that responds to sexual stimuli. These are biologically meaningful behaviors. We should eat, we should engage in sexual behavior, otherwise our species doesn't survive. So there is a part of our brain that responds to these sort of immediate, you might call hedonic pleasures. We should engage in these. But more importantly, we have an executive system, our prefrontal cortex, that was called the executive for a reason. It can respond to the limbic system's desires and veto them if it chooses. So if I'm on a diet, let's say I need to lose weight, and you offer me an entire pizza, that limbic system will say, eat that pizza, because that will taste fantastic right now. My executive system might say, we're not going to do that, because, ultimately you are trying to lose weight. We're going to make a different decision. I think for people who are really in the throes of addiction, that limbic system is hyperactive. So reacting to cocaine will make me feel good now. The executive system might say that's really going to cause problems for us in the long term, but the limbic system is calling the shots. So an analogy you might think of is the limbic system is driving the car, and the executive system's in the back seat trying to give direction, but that limbic system is making the final decisions. It really should be the other way around. There should be some measure of the pros and cons of that behavior. And for some behaviors, the cons so outweigh the pros that we really should never engage in them, right? So for the most part, I'd say using cocaine would be one of them. Okay. But I think it's very difficult when you're really struggling with addiction. You're just going to be extraordinarily oriented to one specific behavior that feels really good right now, and that's really bad for us in the long term. And it feels really good right now specifically because it helps us moderate, it helps us regulate our negative affect. So when we feel anxious, that drink, that cigarette, that cocaine just wipes that anxiety away. Same with depression, irritability, anger, frustration, whatever it might be. When I'm feeling that way, that cigarette, that drink, that line of cocaine can just make those feelings disappear. And even though for a short time, it does help us cope with those feelings, even though they might in fact be worse in the long term. So I think people who are really, addicted are always oriented toward that sort of immediate reinforcement associated with the sort of numbing of negative emotions, even though in the long term it causes many problems. And what is somewhat interesting then about psychedelics, and this has occurred to me, is that whereas alcohol and tobacco and cocaine and opioids and others may all, in a sense, numb our emotions, make us numb to especially unpleasant emotions you'd rather not experience, psychedelics make us acutely aware of them, right? These are experiences in which we very often take a very deep inward look. It's not always pleasant, and we have to take a really good look in the mirror and evaluate our lives, our values, the decisions we've made. And, so these are two vastly different experiences for people who are used to not experiencing emotions. There's an experience that causes you to experience them in a very deep, profound way. And, to look at your life, reevaluate your life from a perspective from which you've never had to evaluate your life. But that's not entirely sure why I think psychedelics might be helpful. Again, I ramble. I'm not sure where we've come since the original question.
No, I was just asking about addiction
what is
in
addiction?
general. But
there
no, that was great. Yeah.
Let me say this. You asked about connectedness. So, I think for many people who have struggled with addiction, they've chosen the drug above and beyond other reinforcers, above and beyond relationships often. So people who've really struggled would say they've lost friendships, marriages, they don't talk to siblings, parents, children. They're in a state of disconnection or isolation. That this pursuit of this hedonic pleasure has cut them off from the people they love the most. When they have these mystical type experiences that are induced by psychedelic, they realize what is my transcendent purpose. And I think this really applies to almost everyone. There could be many, but one we'd all share in common is the people we love. I want to be a source of support. I want to be a source of love to my siblings, my parents, my grandparents, my children, my friends. I want to be there for them. I want to feel like I've made the world a better place for the people I love, and maybe even for other humans I don't. And when I've dedicated my life to the pursuit of this hedonic pleasure, I've cut myself off from those who mean more to me than anything else. And my God, I've got to get my life back on track if I want to be able to look back and say I'm happy with the decisions I made, because I was there for the people I loved, and I was a good citizen of this planet. And I did something to make this world a better place, to help other people, to show love to others. And in the throes of heavy addiction, you're not really able to do anything other than feed this hedonic pursuit, almost on a treadmill. That's really almost all you're doing. And I think many people come to that realization that they've sacrificed what they hold to be most sacred, that is their family, their friends, other people, in pursuit of a high.
Mm-hmm. I feel like too, it's about, as simple as it sounds, like loving yourself and realizing that, for me at least, like in my 20s when I was drinking a lot, just realizing that was self-harm, essentially,
Yeah, that's interesting. I am sort of interested in this concept of self-compassion. And I think it's a somewhat Buddhist notion, so I'm not too familiar with it. I'm trying to learn more about it. But, it's something that we'd certainly advocate with our participants, to, show yourself the same sort of compassion that you would extend to a friend or a family member. Whether psychedelics might have an impact on that, I'm very interested to find out. I'm kind of curious what you think. I'm trying to wrap my mind around that.
Yeah. Well, I feel like for me, it was to have the experience of the feeling of being loved by something completely unconditionally, like the sort of life and relationship review that you were talking about. I experienced that as well, but it was from this place of like non-judgment and no shame. It wasn't like, look at you, terrible person, and your terrible choice. It's like, oh, look at all these survival mechanisms you've built up. You don't need that anymore. And here are your gifts, and like lean into those. It was just, it was the most powerfully loving voice that I'd ever experienced, beyond anything that I'd experienced, in childhood. So it just taught me how to have that conversation with myself.
So a very famous addiction psychologist who did most of his work with alcohol named Bill Miller, he developed something called motivational interviewing. Very widely used technique. And the whole idea is, if you were to come to see me and you had a serious alcohol problem, it wouldn't help you at all for me to sit down and tell you how you need to stop. Right? I would recognize that we're a team, but the motivation to change comes from you. And my job might be to just help you kind of explore your reasons for wanting to change in a very non-judgmental and empathic way. And he later in his career started studying sort of organic mystical experiences that people would have. And he noted that often people felt that they were in the presence of a loving entity that was compassionate and empathic and communicated that you have the free will to make whatever decision you're going to make, right? I'm not going to judge you. I'm not placing any value on what you do. I'm here for you. But, whatever you choose to do is what you choose to do. And I think ultimately then that might be sort of a core component of unconditional love, is also this recognition that you're free to do as you choose. You have that free will, and no one's here to tell you what you should or should not be doing. And perhaps something about being in that environment, feeling, that unconditional love is an experience that makes you more likely to unconditionally love yourself. Maybe that's what it is.
Yes.
That's what it was for you.
For me, that's very resonant. Yeah.
Because we give ourselves really hard time, right? We can really beat ourselves up, and it can help to stop and be reminded, you are loved unconditionally. For those of us who believe in a higher power, that there is this feeling that there is this higher power that loves you unconditionally. You don't have to do anything to earn that love. It's there. And that unconditional power just wants you to be the best version of yourself that you can be. But these are choices for you to make, and I think there's something really kind of beautiful then about that idea that Any entity, any person who loves us unconditionally is really not going to tell us what to do.
They just turn you back to the teacher inside of you.
Yeah,
Yeah. So are these sessions structured, and where are you finding people?
So first question, how are they structured? So we have 4 weekly, what we call preparation sessions. They last for about 2 hours each. And the objective in these preparation sessions is to form a therapeutic alliance with our participants. So you could understand, maybe some of your listeners too, that the experience could potentially be one of the most meaningful and or frightening experience of these people's lives. We try to impart that. We try to communicate this to them, but our participants are naive, have not had a classic psychedelic experience before, no mystical experience before. So their frame of reference for drug use would be cocaine, alcohol, tobacco, marijuana. Generally drugs that are perceived as pleasurable and that you would like to do again and again. And we've told them that this is a substance unlike any other, one that might be very meaningful and beautiful, but one that you probably won't want to repeat, at least very frequently. And that's a difficult notion to wrap your mind around if you've never had that kind of experience before. And I try to use a lot of analogies. I might say, hey, it'd be like running a marathon, right? A lot of people have run marathons and said, that was wonderful. I'm so glad I did it. It changed my life. I felt it was just exhilarating, but there's no way I'm going to do that every weekend. There's no way. Maybe I'll do it once in a lifetime, or once a year, or once every few months. But we try to really communicate how different the experience might be and how important it is to surrender completely to the experience. Because I'm convinced, not only clinically, but from some emerging research, that that's crucial to having a beneficial experience, is surrendering entirely. Easier said than done, but surrendering entirely, immersing oneself entirely in the experience. If you can do that, the chances are that you'll have a beautiful and therapeutic experience. If you fight the experience, if you refuse to let go of your control, if you're frightened from it, you want to run from it, you'll probably have 5 hours of anxiety and panic, and you might not get what you need from it. And in many ways, it's counterintuitive. Like in everyday consciousness, you encounter something frightening, it's a good idea to run away, right? If you encounter a snarling pit bull on the sidewalk, you don't go up to that pit bull and say, hey, what are you doing here? Let me pet you. No, you avoid that thing. People are in these sometimes fright or flight type situations, at least early on, and we're telling them, although you would ordinarily... did I say fright or flight? I meant to say fight or flight. Anyway, although you would ordinarily, run from these stimuli that make you fearful, we're asking you to approach them, to embrace them, to not run from them, knowing that that's sort of key to a successful experience. Again, very easier said than done. And there are a number of analogies you might use, like that the fastest way through that deep, dark forest is to just keep going forward. But I think the experience can often be somewhat like taking a rocket ship into outer space. And that initial blast off is loud and bumpy, and you might look around and wonder, what in the world did I get myself into? But if you can hold on and trust that everything will work out and immerse yourself in that experience, you'll find yourself weightless in outer space for a period of time. So that's really what's critical to us, is that we're very clear about everything that could happen. Any number of things could happen, but it'll be very different. And the key is that you just trust us and completely surrender and immerse yourself in that experience. We then administer the drug. We don't provide it for people to go home with. We're with them when we administer the drug in an outpatient research ward. Right. So there's over in Jefferson Towers, there's a CRU, which stands for Clinical Research Unit. So we have a hospital room with nurses that are attending. If there's any kind of emergency, they can be there right away. We have a physician on call. Now, we try to make this room as comfortable as we can. I've got a Persian rug that used to be in my father's office. I put that down on the floor. In the room, we have, looking toward the altar of Sainte-Chapelle, these beautiful stained glass windows. We have some artwork on the wall. And instead of using fluorescent lights, we use kind of a warmer incandescent lighting. And our participants lie down on a bed. We make sure they're comfortable. We can adjust the bed. and they wear eye shades and earphones that are playing a program of music that was developed by a fellow named Bill Richards, who had worked with Walter Pankey at Harvard in the early days, and later Stan Grof, and he's had a long history in psychedelic or psilocybin research. So it's mostly classical music. It's very very beautiful. I really like it myself. We could probably go in many different directions with that playlist, but we're using kind of a standard playlist for now.
No words.
Very few. So some of the music, again, we didn't select it ourselves, but there's some Bach and some Brahms, and there's some German chorale that, again, I find very beautiful. I think there might be some French. There's an artist, what is his name? Russell Paul, who's an Indian musician, and so there's some of his music that contains Indian language. And near the end, we have English language music. So Here Comes the Sun by the Beatles, and Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, sung by Leontine Price, who's from Mississippi.
Wow.
What a Wonderful World by Louis Armstrong, and a few others. But it's not until they're sort of really coming out of that experience that we use English language music. I think the idea is we want them to have an experience that is not cognitive so much as it is emotional. And maybe, words that they recognize might prevent them from sort of going along with this experience without overthinking it. So imagine you go to a movie and your friend wants to talk your ear off the entire movie. You'd say, hey, let's wait until the end. Right now, just immerse yourself in it. We'll talk about it at the end. And I think our thought is, if there was English language lyrics that might kind of stop them from just kind of going with the flow, they might stop and start thinking and analyzing. We don't want them to do that. But, these are empirical questions. Maybe it would be better if we had music that was tailored to the participants, that was, maybe, more culturally relevant. I don't know. We'll have to, in the future, examine that further.
And then they're in the experience all day?
Yeah, from about 8 in the morning until, time course is 5 to 6 hours. So by 1 or 2, the drug effects have ended, but we'll keep them a bit longer just to make sure they're well enough to go back home. And we've always arranged for a ride, usually a family member or friend, to pick them up, take them home, and tell them, don't operate a car for the rest of the day, stay home, take it easy. Of course, that doesn't prevent us from having them complete some questionnaires at the end of their experience. We have to do that. They then come back to see us the next day. We check in, make sure everything's okay. Sometimes people have difficult experiences and they need to talk about them right away. So we want to be there for them. And then we meet with them 4 more times to begin to sort of integrate this experience. So what do we mean by that? Well, okay, what lessons can we learn from the experience? How do we apply that specifically to changing your behavior, ceasing cocaine use? And most people don't need our help in making those interpretations. I mean, they get the message pretty quickly. They know what they need to do. The interesting thing is, often it becomes about so much more than just cocaine. It's, okay, cocaine was sort of symptomatic of a larger problem. Or, yeah, okay, so the issue was I was using cocaine, which had isolated me from the people I love. Now, obviously I'm not going to use cocaine anymore. How do I integrate myself back into the lives of the people who I love and who perhaps I've burned enough now? They'll be very skeptical that I have indeed changed. Oh, and by the way, I'd also like to lose weight and start eating better and start reading more and meditating and start going to church again. And, a lot of changes they want to make.
Yeah.
And it can be I'm sure a bit overwhelming for them, but also us too, if the initial focus was ceasing cocaine use and now it's become about being, a whole well-rounded person. There's a lot to work on, and we've got 4 sessions to try to accomplish all that, and that's nowhere nearly enough. But this is a research study and not a real-world clinical practice. If it were, I'd say, let's meet for as long as you can, because it sounds like we've got a lot to work on, and you've got that motivation to make the change, so let's capitalize on that.
But it sounds like you're seeing pretty immediate results in the time period that you are with these people.
So again, trying to be, objective and dispassionate. It would appear that the people who I would assume were randomized to receive psilocybin, yes, experienced some pretty dramatic changes.
Oh, so this is double blind?
Yes.
Okay.
So they'll either receive psilocybin or placebo. And I'm trying very hard not to think about the drug that the participant received. I'm afraid it's fairly obvious. And, that's a challenge for research going forward. How do you develop a true placebo that would mask not only the participant, but the therapist?
Right.
And that may just be impossible.
Yeah. It's interesting. I hear you being really thoughtful about the way that you're talking about all of this. And I'm curious what the role you feel like of science specifically in this kind of psychedelic therapy, like what are you accountable to in the work that you're doing?
Well, so, I think ultimately science is a process that was developed to protect us against confirmation bias. Right? So we all have a way of seeing the world and remembering information that confirms what we already hold to be true. And I think it would be easy for any of us to go into this sort of line of work assuming that psilocybin, LSD, ayahuasca, peyote, whatever it may be, is beneficial. And, if that was our strong assumption, then we'd very likely fall victim to confirmation bias. I mean, I think the important thing is that we have a very objective view of what these substances can do, what kind of change they might facilitate, how long that change can be maintained, but also have a very objective view of the risks, the safety profile, the pros and cons. I know there's a community of what we might call psychedelic enthusiasts, psychonauts, or whatever term you might want to use, and I really appreciate their support. That community has been extraordinarily supportive of this work, and it really means a lot to me. But we can't go into this line of work assuming that we already know the answers to our questions. I mean, we certainly have hypotheses. We think this could be beneficial for mental health. But, if we do the science the right way, then we can essentially say, look, in many ways, we bent over backwards to disprove our hypothesis. And yet we still found support for it. And I think that's what's most important, right? Collecting data as objectively as we can, and really going out of our way to disprove our hypothesis that psychedelics are beneficial to mental health. We still found that they're beneficial. And therefore we can move these treatments into the population, the real world, confident in our findings, and not potentially overconfident in what we believe to be the case. So as an example, there are probably individual factors that predict response to psychedelics. Some people are likely to benefit quite a bit. Some people may not. What are those factors that can determine your response to the drug? I don't know. But that's something that scientists can determine. And I think as excited, as enthusiastic as many of us might be about psilocybin, others, we probably have to acknowledge that these are treatments that are not going to work for everyone. So, I mean, I think science is a way to contain enthusiasm and allow us to see things from a very objective standpoint so that we can take our findings to the most skeptical person and feel really confident about what we've done. I mean, I think sometimes the best scientists are the most skeptical ones. Like if we really wanted to say, look, we're really, really confident that psilocybin can do what we think it can do, have somebody who's extremely skeptical about that idea conduct the study. Because they'll say, okay, we're going to set things up such that if indeed psilocybin does what you claim it does, then it would have really impressed me. It would have changed my mind. That's how we want to do it. That way we can say we're really confident about this. We haven't made a mistake in falling prey to confirmation bias. Like these are legitimate findings.
So where are you in that process?
So our pilot trial is one that will recruit 40 people, and I think we're hovering around 30 right now. So we're close to being done, but studies that target cocaine use are associated with the highest rates of dropout.
Why is that?
I think major stimulants are very strongly associated with sort of impulsive, risky behavior. They can lead to a great deal of disturbance in sort of cognitive functioning. You think major stimulants, what do they do? Why do we call them stimulants? Because they increase your heart rate, your blood pressure, your respiration rate, your movement. You feel extraordinarily confident. You feel invincible. And attending regular treatment sessions requires a degree of cognitive behavioral control. I think this is just a drug that really disrupts that. It makes it really hard to plan out your day and reliably go to appointments. But
how are you recruiting people?
We've tried a number of different things. We've tried print ads. They haven't been very successful. We tried online ads, not very successful. We've tried flyers, some success. TV ads seem to be most successful, but they're also the most expensive.
I'm curious what it's like to do that. Well, just first of all, at this university, like how you've been received, but also in the South, which my perception is that you would perhaps have more challenges to cut through. I don't know if that's accurate.
You would think so. And that's one of the most common comments I get from people who are outside of Alabama. And what I would say is, first of all, as I mentioned before, it's a nonpartisan issue. Everybody has been impacted by mental health struggles, whether it be addiction or depression. And I think people understand that those of us who are doing this work, there's no political motivation. This is not the darling issue of the left or the right or anyone for that matter. It's one that we can all get behind. It's one that brings us together, one that we're all unified in. So we're trying to improve the state of mental health treatment. Who would have a problem with that? I don't think anyone. Now, I wouldn't want to assume that, yes, that there would not be some political overtones here. There are. But Birmingham is known as a very blue dot in an otherwise red sea. Our mayor was one of Bernie Sanders' handpicked Our Revolution candidates, Randall Woodfin. He's a Democratic mayor. He unseated a previous Democratic mayor who apparently wasn't progressive enough for the city of Birmingham. And it's a medical university. There are a lot of different studies being conducted here, including studies with ketamine, studies with CBD for seizure disorder. And I think objectively speaking, there's really nothing sensational about what we're doing. That said, I get the impression, too, that in the more red politically parts of Alabama, there's a libertarian streak. And I get this from people. They'll say, yeah, the government has no business telling you what you can or cannot put in your body. No business. And by the way, I grew up on a farm and we used to go into the cow patties, and your idea makes a lot of sense. So, some combination of a progressive political landscape in the city, maybe a more libertarian one in the country, combined with a very fertile part of the country with regard to psilocybe growth, suggests to me that people are supportive.
Wow, that makes me so happy.
Yeah.
It's like everybody's on the same team from whatever perspective. That's cool. That's cool.
Yeah, I'm very happy about that. Very. I was worried at first there might be, some sort of political blowback given the history. So I was careful to sort of lay low. And I've realized I don't have to do that. And everyone's been supportive, regardless of where they are in the political spectrum, and that is what makes me really happy. There was an initiative in Congress that AOC had proposed, and I don't really want to get into the specifics, but the idea was that this would make research with psychedelics easier to do. And the co-sponsor on that initiative was Matt Gaetz, who I think it's fair to say is on the other end of the political spectrum. So you have really people on the opposite ends of the political spectrum who are co-sponsoring this initiative together. And that was really cool to see.
Yeah.
So, I would really, really like to see that people I know things are very highly charged and politically polarized at the moment. I would say this is one area where we can say there's no need for discussion of politics. We're all behind it.
Yeah, yeah.
Which, ironically is what the psychedelic experience is all about.
Yeah. Well, then, not to drag you into politics, because I actually think criminal justice is just like a human right issue. But, earlier we were talking about the relationship between addiction and policing. Like, do you have a vision for how sort of what you're discovering could shape society?
How my research could shape society?
Yeah, or what you're finding.
I don't think that my research informs policy. Well, okay. I think it would say something about an FDA indication of psilocybin for some different mental health conditions. So we might see, the FDA would acknowledge that psilocybin is indicated for cocaine dependence, for depression, for smoking cessation. That would be exciting because, like I said, I think before we started recording, there are some people who are not going to make use of these treatments unless they are offered in a formal, legitimate medical setting. There are people who do make use of them outside of those settings, but I always like to say, your hypothetical grandmother, like if she needs help with depression, is she going to go to an underground ayahuasca ceremony? Probably not. But would she go to a hospital with doctors in white lab coats administering this drug in a very carefully controlled setting? I think so. So if our hypotheses are supported, if we show safety and efficacy, then the FDA would say, well, this substance is indicated for this condition, we'd see a change in schedule. I mean, that would have to happen. It couldn't remain Schedule 1 with an FDA indication. Mm-hmm. But in terms of your question, right, in terms of criminalization issues, I firmly believe that possession of any drug for personal use should be decriminalized. Mm. And that is a concept that people misunderstand. When I say that, they often think what I'm arguing for is the commercialization of every drug, and that's not at all what I'm saying. And it's a strange argument that some people might use. Like, well, so you're advocating for the sale of heroin on every street corner. Of course not. Of course not. That's absurd. All I'm saying is, if somebody has an addiction issue, we shouldn't treat them like a criminal. Mm. We should provide them the treatment they need. So if somebody is in possession of cocaine for personal use, instead of incarcerating them, which does nothing for them whatsoever, let's be compassionate and at least explore some other alternatives. Offer them treatment. The same would go for opioids or any other number of addiction-related issues. As I said to you before, there's not a single one of us who, if someone we loved and cared for had an addiction issue, would think that we should call the police, because we recognize that that does nothing but punish them for a problem for which they're already punished, right? So, if you mentioned that you struggled when you were younger with alcohol, so you would know, oh man, it's disrupting your health, your occupation. You find it difficult to work, difficult to maintain relationships. You're probably making really risky decisions. There's a lot of, you're already being punished quite a bit for this behavior. If you add to that now legal problems, it doesn't help anything at all. It's the so-called war on drugs has just been a failure. We've thrown trillions of dollars at this issue as though it's a battle to be won. When in fact, what we need to do is take a different approach and try to be more compassionate, at least toward the people who are actively struggling with addiction. So you talk about these decriminalization initiatives in Portland or in Oregon. Is it the state or in the city?
I think it's Oregon.
So in Oregon and Oakland. I think it's kind of funny. I lived in the Bay Area for a while. So Denver decriminalized psilocybin, and Oakland said, "Well, we'll one up you, and we'll extend that to ayahuasca and peyote also." Very funny, Oakland. This is all fine, but we can't assume that psychedelics are an exception, right? And the argument that's often been used is they seem to be associated with some sort of therapeutic benefit. They're not dangerous. They're not addictive. And they're relatively safe. I shouldn't say that they're not dangerous, but relative to the other drugs, they have fewer risks, and that's the reason we should decriminalize? No. No. We should decriminalize all drugs because treating people who are using drugs like criminals doesn't help them. So my concern is if the argument is psilocybin should be decriminalized because it's relatively benign, it's relatively harmless, and it even has some benefit, then we'll never get to the point where we can also decriminalize cocaine or heroin because the argument will be clearly they're dangerous and addictive and therefore should remain criminal. Well, again, now we're punishing people who are struggling with addiction, and that doesn't do them any good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the tact that, didn't Portugal do that? They decriminalize every substance. And so what happens is they just have this menu of services. And they're like, okay, how can we help you? How can we provide you with childcare so you can be in counseling? And
right. I'm somewhat familiar with the Portugal model. I think a lot of people are looking to that to see what might happen. Now, there's probably no one perfect way to liberalize our drug laws. I would refer the policy experts' comment on that. But harm reduction is clearly the name of the game. And supervised injection sites, that seems to be a good idea to me. But there are probably pros and cons associated with any of these measures. You think of what's happened in Colorado with really commercialization of cannabis. You in many ways are going to minimize, if not eliminate, a black market. I think that's good. That means now children, people under the age of 18, really don't have anywhere to go to obtain the drug. I think that's a good thing. There's a quality control element with a regulated product, which is a good thing. But also, although the majority of people who use cannabis don't struggle with it, maybe 95% can use in a responsible way that's not marked by dependence or addiction, 5 to 10% do. And as more people use, more and more people will really struggle. And also, when you have a sort of a profit-based industry that's behind this market, they realize, much like with alcohol, the majority of their profits come from very heavy users. And that to me means potentially the problem is that the industry has a vested interest in promoting heavy use. People who might use some weekends, every weekend, they don't generate much revenue at all. But the people who do it every day do. So now are we going to see efforts designed to encourage people to use more and more and more? Albeit, cannabis is fairly benign as far as recreational drugs go. There are some people who struggle, and I wouldn't think it was a good idea for someone to use every day.
This may be outside of your purview, but I'm wondering if you have thoughts on sort of the traditional rehab model. These places where people go for like a couple weeks, you see the advertisements.
Well, hey, I'll just say this. John Oliver did a really, really good expose on these addiction treatment centers. Just watch the John Oliver segment. It's available online. But I think that the short answer is they are scamming people out of their money. And I'll probably get in trouble just for saying that. I won't name any institutions, but I'll just say based on my understanding from John Oliver's expose and other readings, I don't know that there's much data at all that supports the efficacy of these treatment centers. They're very expensive. I don't know that they're really helping anybody. Your best bet is to seek treatment from a psychologist or psychiatrist in an outpatient setting. I think in most cases, an outpatient setting will work just fine. I think the data would suggest that outpatient, inpatient produce the same results. But, people are spending a lot of money on a product that's not providing the results that are promised, which is really discouraging. And I think this is the thing about addiction is we've been trying to tackle the problem now for quite a while, and it's a chronic relapsing disorder. There's no treatment that we would say is fantastic that works a high percentage of the time. Smoking cessation, take that as an example. If you were smoking, I give you the very, very, very best treatment money could buy. Behavioral counseling with medication, 30% likelihood you quit.
Wow, that's not great.
Not great. Now, my friend Matt Johnson, who's done some smoking cessation work at Johns Hopkins, in one of his studies, he reported rates of 80% abstinence. That was a small sample, no placebo condition. I believe in some of his larger studies with the placebo control, he can still get that number up to like nearly 60%.
This is with psilocybin?
With psilocybin.
Wow.
So, if most traditional treatments can produce abstinence rates of 30%, psilocybin is doubling that. That's for any one sort of go round. So any one time you try, maybe your chances are 60%. It didn't work the first time around. Try it again, and your odds are going to probably increase every time. Although it might be the case that one's first experience with the psychedelic is really the most profound and life-changing, and there really might be sort of a rate of diminishing returns where further experiences are not quite as meaningful or profound. Maybe I'm wrong. I'd like to be, but it might be somewhat like Ebenezer Scrooge feeling like he needed to be visited every Christmas Eve, and if he needed to be visited every Christmas Eve, you really wonder what was the point of that first experience at all. I think it was Alan Watts or one of these early philosophers who said, when you get the message, you hang up the phone. So I guess one question for future research is what will be the role of booster sessions? Is it that you have one experience, you make that change and that's that, or do you need to continue to return to it to be reminded of some of your lessons? Or if there's a purely pharmacologic mechanism of action, maybe if it has something to do with inflammation in the central nervous system, you just need to return to it every now and then to reduce that inflammation. I don't know. I'd like to see. I know a lot of elder traditions include repeated administrations across the lifetime, but I think there is something about that first experience that seems to be really profound.
Well, I think it has so much to do also with the community that you're going back into, because if you're kind of going into the same matrix that created the trauma and the disconnection that might have led you into the self-destructive behaviors, it can be really hard to bring the new patterns and new growth back to the same context. But
then the question then is it the community that's providing the benefit, or is it the experience, or both?
Right.
Look, I think at the center of the mystical experience is this feeling of awe. Okay, I'm in the presence of something so great and so different than anything I've ever experienced. I have to change the way I view reality. I feel very, very, very small. I may not even exist. And yet I feel very connected with others. I'm one with others. And I'm seeing things from a new perspective. I have this profound insight, introspection. It all comes from being in the presence of something bigger and outside my understanding. And I think, with religious practice, that's often what people are seeking, that same feeling. And, maybe our modern times require something different. I think it seems to me that modern religion isn't really touching people the way it used to. But, if you think of my own ancestors in Europe hundreds of years ago, if they were living in a thatched hut they probably shared with animals, I don't know, probably smelled terrible. And there were no TVs and no radios, no access to music. And if you could attend a service in a incredible structure with stained glass windows and a music from trained singers and ritual and prayer and frankincense and so on, I think all of that was sort of designed to promote a kind of mystical, awe, transcendent type experience. So I think people seek that without the drug, but it may be that in our modern world it's not really getting the job done anymore. So you may have alluded to this earlier, but I think there are ways that you can capture that kind of experience, that experience of awe and smallness, mysticism without the drug. And it really, I think we all have to test what works best for us, but music, art, absolutely can engender these feelings. Exposure to nature. If you ever have the chance to, get in a rocket ship and actually go to the moon, I'm sure that would work pretty well. Spending time by the ocean. It varies from person to person, but I'd say, even without these substances, we can all feel that sense of smallness and wonder and amazement if we just look for it. And maybe that's really ultimately what's the key, is to always look for those kind of experiences.
Keep it alive.
Somehow, yeah. And, maybe that's what those booster sessions would do, is keep alive that feeling of wonder. I don't know. I mean, there's so many questions I have. I could spend the rest of my career trying to answer them. But I think we probably do need to, look to those elder traditions, get a sense of what they've done, and probably learn something from that. So, what typically happens with ayahuasca, I understand that it might be a regular sort of occurrence. Same with peyote. So I think it would make sense that we'd be at the place where people would have the option of some sort of booster session at certain intervals. What do you think? I'm curious.
I think it's a quarterly practice.
Okay.
In my life, at least, I find that helpful. It's nice to check in with, like 4-ish times a year.
Is it as mind-blowing for you every time? I mean, I'm sure the first time you're like, oh my God, that was incredible.
Yeah.
Every time you return, is it, oh my God, that was incredible? Or was it, I'm familiar with that space. I've been there, I've done that.
I don't get jaded, for sure. In fact, I think, so my entree into psychedelics was ayahuasca, and that is so intense that I think I spent a lot of my first ceremonies just like trying to stay alive, just like remember to keep
fighting.
Breathing and witness like what's happening. Yeah, exactly. The resistance was strong. So it's like learning a landscape or a language, and the more proficient I become at arriving there gracefully, the more...
Which was probably the better you got at letting go.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Then the more agency I feel like I have there to explore, whether that means I want to work on this problem or like the last ceremony I had been talking to a lot of people through this podcast actually who are connected to higher wisdom in various ways. And so I went into it kind of saying, if there are any beings that want to present themselves to me who are with me in life that I don't know, I'd love to meet you. And like that happened. So
really?
Yeah.
So there is something new for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you still get a little scared at times?
For sure. Every time I'm like, I have no idea what's going to happen. I know it'll be okay, but I have no idea what's going to happen.
And do you have nausea every time? Do you vomit every time? Do you purge every time?
I usually have some kind of purge. Yeah, it's not necessarily vomiting, but that's another thing that I've come into with more grace, I think, is at the beginning it was like, that feels bad, I don't want to do that. And now it's like, yeah, please take whatever is not serving me. Like, please help me get it out of me, however it needs to come out.
I think Leary had this idea that the sort of physical symptoms that people report are like a psychosomatic symptom, like it's a somatic representation of resistance. Now, he may very well be correct, but even for people who are very open to the ayahuasca experience, I think there's a good chance there's going to be a purge, right? No matter how open you are. So, there are a lot of serotonin receptors in our gut, more than really our brain. So if you ingest a serotonin agonist, it's going to make you feel kind of funny one way or the other.
That makes sense.
But there might be something to the idea that people who really, really, really struggle with it are resisting a little bit more than others. But it sounds like from your experience, you would sort of advocate for a quarterly return.
For sure. Yeah. I don't know about ayahuasca necessarily, but psilocybin for sure. Quarterly. Yeah.
And there are new sort of insights that come every time. Huh?
For sure.
New and different
100%.
experiences.
Yeah.
I mean, it can't possibly be as novel as the first.
Not in that way of like, there's no way to explain psychedelics to somebody that's never done it. It's just like you just have to do it and experience it. So you get that awakening of, oh, this is what all the art is alluding to, and this is what all the, you have the aha moments. But also, like, I accumulate, I'm going to use non-scientific language. I accumulate more karma in the time between journeys. So there's more stuff to work on. Like, I'm not perfect in all of my relationships and behaviors in that time. So when I visit again, it's like there's plenty to review.
Yeah, we are like constant works in progress.
Yeah.
If we ever get to the point where we feel like, well, I've kind of attained perfection, then it's probably a red flag. When I was younger, my parents would take us to the Outer Banks of North Carolina. These are barrier islands.
Beautiful.
My parents are from North Carolina. They met in Chapel Hill. My dad went to law school in D.C. That's why I'm from D.C. But we drive down, and back then, of course, I don't know if we had air conditioning or not. I remember it being really hot. Vinyl seats. We'd roll the windows down, and it wasn't easy to get there. 5 or 6 or 7 hours in the car felt like an eternity to a child. We'd finally get to the beach, and I was so excited to see the ocean, that my brother and I, we'd get out of the car and we'd run down in our clothes and jump in the water, and we'd be soaking and just having a great time. And we must have done that the first few times. Eventually, we got to the point where, okay, that ocean's amazing, but we're going to put on our bathing suits before we dive in. And so I feel like there was, for us, this sort of some degree of habituation, but never did I reach a point where I thought the ocean is boring.
Right.
Like, I still love being there. I'm just not so blown away that I feel like I have to dive in with my clothes in.
Right.
Clothes on, sorry. So maybe that's an analogy that would be useful. Like, maybe those first few experiences are really, really life-changing, and the following experiences may not be quite as much, but there's still a benefit that you can derive from them.
For sure. And with something like ayahuasca, too, I mean, the way that the practitioners would talk about it, at least, it's like you might have the first 4 ceremonies are like you're just working on your own trauma and your own healing. And then you might have a journey where you're dealing with ancestral stuff, or you're dealing with the feeling of like chaos and doom that's, engulfing so many of us right now. Like, there was one night where this guy was just, you can hear him all night, purging all night. And the next day, it's like, how you doing? What was that all about? And he was like, it was lifetimes, So whatever that means on a physiological, emotional, practical level, I'm not sure. But his experience was that he was letting go of stuff that wasn't even experienced in this lifetime.
Now, I know you wanted to interview me, but I have some questions for you. Is it okay if I ask? So you said like ancestral. So I noticed your name is this kind of classic Celtic name, maybe Irish or Scottish. Did you ever had any kind of connection to that part of your ancestry?
Yeah. Well, I've been to Ireland a couple times, but I feel very connected to pre-Judeo-Christian women and that energy. And I don't have any kind of formal knowledge or training, but I feel that independent spirit in me. I had a guy once look at me and he was like, "Oh, you're one of those Celtic priestesses that the Vikings kidnapped." I was like, "Yeah."
I saw your name and it just seemed familiar to me. And shortly before you arrived, I thought, well, how do I know that name? And I Googled it, and it apparently means like son of the dogs of the sea, something like that, right? And it's essentially a reference to Vikings. Like the Vikings were dogs of the sea, these marauders who'd come in on their boats.
Gosh, you're giving me goosebumps.
So the idea is that maybe you are a descendant of a Viking who stayed in Ireland or Scotland. Like you are the son of those sea dogs.
Wow. Thank you. I had never connected that. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Like I said, my mother was a theologian, and she showed me something once that indicated in the very early days of Christianity that in Ireland, women were very much involved in the church and had leadership roles. And it wasn't until later that somebody had the idea that women shouldn't have these sort of positions. But I think my understanding is that maybe these Celtic cultures were a bit more egalitarian than others.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong.
That's my sense too. I don't know. Yeah.
It's hard to say because I know women have been oppressed, like virtually since the beginning of time, but there seem to be some cultures that are a little more egalitarian than others. So maybe there's something there you're connecting to, huh?
Well, and the Druid culture is so earth-based, which to me is tied very much to like feminine energy, and I feel like women were given a lot more honor for the knowledge that they kept in that part of wisdom.
And for being literally the source of life.
Yeah, also that.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned also trauma, and I'm not asking you to share any trauma, but the interesting thing is we wouldn't recruit people who meet criteria for PTSD, but virtually everybody has a traumatic event that played a role in their lives.
Right.
And, we've had some people tell us, there was one so profound, without giving away too much, a participant, a woman who'd said that she was able to see her life sort of all at once, like a frieze, like a tapestry or something that would tell a story, but you could see the beginning, middle, and end all at once. And she said that she could see her life like that. All at once she could see beginning, middle, and where she is now. Wow. And she was able to trace her life back to a traumatic event that she realized put her on this path to addiction. She saw with the trauma, she made a series of decisions that were ultimately based in a desire to cope with that trauma, but she recognized were maladaptive ways of doing so. And she said, I was able to trace myself back to the trauma and put myself back on this more adaptive path.
Wow.
Like that. She felt like she'd resolved it.
Makes me want to cry.
Pretty incredible.
Yeah.
There's a literature on post-traumatic growth, and someone has something awful happen to them, and they find a silver lining there, right? They'd be able to say, though I'd never wished that on anybody, and if I could go back in time, that never would have happened, and yet I found a way to grow as a result. And often that means looking at that traumatic event and reframing it in a more positive way. Like, now as a result of that, I have more compassion for people who've been through the same thing. Now as a result of that, there are a list of things that you might be able to say about a negative event that's made you a stronger person. And it seems like sometimes in these experiences, people are able to go back and reframe these experiences, which may have been before seen as nothing but awful, negative, and how could that have happened? Why did that happen? Look where I am now to, you know what? It doesn't define me. And in fact, I feel very strong that I survived, and I'm a better person for it. Did you ever have that kind of insight yourself? I wonder.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely have childhood wounds that I think what you're saying actually ties back to the self-love thing, because it's like if you can learn to accept the things that have happened to you as now gifts that you have to be able to offer other people who've walked the same thing, you're also able to like love who you are in this moment. But if you're always in resistance to those wounds, then you're always denying a part of who you are right now. And I think that's really healing.
That's really interesting. So, I mean, part of that, it sounds like a release of self-blame.
For sure. A lot of that. Which I've heard from a lot of people that are dealing with childhood sexual trauma specifically. There's so much of that because your feelings about sexual trauma can be so... You can feel, that maybe part of you wanted it, or that you went along with it in some way, and there can be so much guilt and shame around all of that when, especially when you're a child and you have so little agency. So to be able to go back and just like love that child completely for all of the things that were experienced, that's huge.
Say, I love you. It's not your fault. You did nothing wrong. You're not worthless. You have value. That's, by the way, what this same participant said, that she saw herself as this child and was able to embrace herself and say, I love you. It's not your fault. What happened to you is not your fault. And there's some release in embracing and loving yourself. And maybe the word is it's a release of shame, right? Where you can go from saying that there's something wrong with me, I'm defective in some way, to saying, maybe I've made some mistakes, but it doesn't mean that I can't be better. Huh. You're kind of giving me goosebumps talking about this. It's really fascinating to hear this. I mean, the thing is, traditional psychotherapy, you can work with someone for years and years and years, and you make gains. There's no doubt it works. It does. You make little gains. Never have I seen people make these such huge gains in a short period of time. In many ways, you might wonder that it would make someone who does what I do obsolete. Right? So you can work with me for 10 years. And at year 10, we would have made the sort of jump that you could otherwise make in 6 hours.
Right, yeah.
I would love to put myself out of business.
Yeah.
And, maybe I'd try to, I don't know, develop some sort of clean burning fuel or something like that. But I mean, I think it's really pretty amazing. I think if we're able to provide a space where people feel completely at ease, they realize that they're supported by us, they can trust us. But this is easier said than done now, right? We are greeting people who've never met us before, people who live in the community, who come to this research university. They walk into this lab. They trust us when we say we've got this medication that could really change your life, and they say, okay, I'll do it. I've never met you before. I don't know you. I don't know anything about you, but let's do this. We spend 4 weeks getting to know them well, recognizing, again, acknowledging this could be the most profoundly meaningful, beautiful experience of your life, and also the most terrifying experience of your life, all in one. And you okay with doing that with us right there by your side? Yes. So people do that. We're in the room with them. We tell them, if you're struggling, we're there to help you, mostly to encourage them to dive in, surrender, immerse themselves in that experience. And, if people are able to do that, and we're able to provide an environment where people feel unconditional positive regard. This is a term from Carl Rogers, if you're familiar with humanistic psychology. Really important, right? So they can feel not judged. They feel that they are accepted for who they are. They're in the presence of people who very authentically, truly care about them and want to see them improved. And I think, provided they can really let go, which is only really going to happen, I think, if in this sort of context of trust and comfort and alliance, then wow, we can accomplish in that day what would otherwise take years and years and years. And sometimes I think, so you're going to come in, Monday at 7:30, this version of who you are. By the end, you're going to be the same person in many ways. I mean, your cognition will be the same. You're not going to be significantly altered, but I think you're going to find that you are much closer to being the version of yourself you'd like to be. And, that doesn't resonate often because it's an experience unlike any other. You have to, I guess, just experience it to know what I'm talking about. And sure enough, they're like, wow, you were right about that.
Yeah.
It's really funny to me because there are some times where, I'll leave the CRU, we'll just go down to the street where they're waiting for their ride. And, just down by the Jefferson Towers here at UAB, there are a number of fast food restaurants. So we go to the bottom of this building, and there's a Milo's, like a burger joint right across the street, and their ride will say, I'll pick you up at the Milo's because it's an easy landmark. And we'll go in there, and maybe we'll order iced teas or something. We'll be sitting there sipping on iced tea, and they'll look at me and they'll think, this is the craziest thing in the world. We're just sitting here at a Milo's sipping iced teas when just a few moments ago, I experienced absolute oneness with all creation and came face to face with God. And now we're just sipping iced teas. I'm like, yeah, well, it's pretty funny, isn't it? And even funnier, like, I've got to go check my emails in a little bit and work on some Excel spreadsheets. And there's, I guess an old Chinese proverb that Wiles, my research assistant there in the other room, introduced me to. And it's apparently before enlightenment, chop wood, bring water. After enlightenment, chop wood, bring water. But there's something so humorous about, like, after that experience, you just got to go on your everyday business.
Right.
Fill up your tank and go buy some milk at the store tonight. And
Totally.
It's crazy. It's really crazy. I think, if you're interested, your listeners are interested, there's a great book called Storming Heaven by, last name is Stevens. And it covers that first era of psychedelic research and some of the cultural stuff that was happening. And again, Leary, who I do respect for his intellect, I'm like, again, far smarter than I could ever be, and his charisma, he began to have this idea that LSD could stand for let society disintegrate. This idea that you're entering into this other space so frequently that after a while you may not even care about this world of time and space. And well, he'd even say, aren't politics funny? Why people even care about that sort of thing? Who cares about that? And there were even these ideas that he and even Ken Kesey had, which was, hey, instead of getting all worked up about the politics and protesting, just ignore them altogether. And I mean, I can understand how you could get to that place, but that's one aspect of the psychedelic experience that might concern me a little bit. I think it's good to be concerned about the plight of your fellow people And to say, who cares? I'm just going to sign out altogether. That's kind of frightening. So in the research that we'll do, I think it's important to keep in mind, as you said, being objective, that there's probably a degree of use that could be harmful in some way. Now, certainly those people who'd say, hey, I've stopped caring about politics are probably really happy. Right? But, I think a certain disengagement with the world of here and now is probably not a good thing. And, it's probably on that kind of continuum of psychosis. And so if you know anyone who's going on rather intense psychedelic journeys every weekend for an extended period of time, you might tell them to take their foot off the pedal a little bit.
Or just make sure it's being grounded or integrated,
Right.
At least in my experience, I think when people do go into psychedelic exploration, there can be a phase where it's like, you just want to be high. You want to be in that place of, it feels really good to be one with all things. But I feel like if you keep listening and holding yourself accountable to really doing work, you need to be in love with the human experience. Like, you came here in a human body to be with other humans. And, like, these are lessons, but your job is to learn how to embody them and, like, make that heaven manifest here in this realm.
Right. So it sounds like there could be some people who do use it as an escape mechanism.
I think there could be, yeah. I think ayahuasca, maybe that would be, I don't know too many people that, like, would escape into ayahuasca, but I think LSD, sure, you could use it that way.
As hard as it is for me to wrap my mind around that idea, but it certainly seems like that might be the case. I think it was Houston Smith, a comparative religion scholar who worked with some of those folks at Harvard early on, who said one thing that seems to distinguish people who have these sort of organic mystical experiences from those that were drug induced is that virtually all those who have these sort of organic mystical experience, they act on them and they think about them almost for the rest of their lives. You didn't see it, but in my office there's a picture of a Christian mystic, Hildegard of Bingen. She was a German mystic and an extremely impressive woman, a musician. You can listen to some of her music to this day. An artist, a scholar, an incredible brain, really incredible brain. And she had this mystical experience that was organic early in life, and that just shaped everything for her moving forward. And she continued to think back to it, continued to think back to it, continued to think back to it. Even there's some beautiful art that she had, I think it's a painting of some sort, it might be a tapestry, but some of these mandalas that you see, this is of course from her own Christian tradition. It was more from that tradition, but again, you see common visual themes. But she thought back to this for the rest of her life. It inspired her, inspired what she did. And Houston said that's what you typically see with those who've had these organic mystical experiences. But if it was induced by LSD or psilocybin, sometimes they think back on it and act on it. Sometimes they don't. Maybe it can be short-lived, or sometimes they just seek to kind of return to it time and again. And so I think you're right. A critical component is now like really taking that experience seriously, really listening to those lessons and applying them in a very intentional way. And I know, some people I've talked to, I meet people like you often. It's really interesting who have these ayahuasca experiences. They often tell me, that if they haven't applied those lessons, next time they pay a visit to Mama Ayahuasca, she's not going to be happy with them. So, there seems to be some accountability there too,
totally,
which is a good thing. But you don't often hear that with, LSD or psilocybin. No. There's no sort of mother-like spirit who's not going to be happy with you if you haven't listened to those lessons.
Right.
So I wonder if that's just like a cultural expectation that finds its way into that experience, just because that's sort of the cultural framework with regard to ayahuasca, or if there's something unique about ayahuasca that provides for that sort of that experience of a Gaian Mother Earth-like spirit. I don't know. Do you only have that experience of a motherly spirit with ayahuasca and not with others?
I feel like psilocybin definitely has an agenda. If people are talking to me about like wanting to have a psychedelic experience, and sometimes I'm honest and just like, MDMA might be a kind place to start if you're just like dealing with trauma and you just want to have love shown on you. Because psilocybin, you're going to get there and it's going to do it, but like you might have some really wavy hours of like walking through the forest, because she's like, I want you to get better, and in order to get better you have to look at these things in this way. And with LSD I feel like it's much more digital almost. It's just like, here's the virtual reality. You have the controls now. Do what you will. It's like more of a play space, and I don't feel as much this agenda or like even the like sentient consciousness behind it the way that I do with plants.
Isn't that interesting? I mean, LSD certainly comes from a fungus that grows on rye. Some of the things I've heard from others have been, I think, what Terence McKenna said, that if cannabis has kind of a feminine, loving, nurturing spirit, that psilocybin has a very assertive, masculine sort of spirit. Like, this is what is happening. I've heard some people say that psilocybin is like jumping out of an airplane with a parachute. LSD is like skydiving, no parachute at all. Some people claim LSD has like a mischievous element to it. Like it's kind of a trickster. It has that, like from Scandinavian lore, like Loki, like kind of a trickster. Who knows what's going to happen? Maybe, you're going to get a funny little joke played on you in the middle of all this. And then, of course, ayahuasca has that Earth Mother sort of vibe. But, maybe these are all just expectations given the cultural context, and this is what people tell us beforehand, so this is the experience we have. But, I mean, it would be really interesting if we found that each one of these psychedelics, so similar in many ways, each have their own sort of character. And, I mean, wouldn't it be interesting if you had people who had never had these experiences, never heard anything about them, and you randomly assign them to receive these different drugs, and they tell you independently, oh yeah, there was a mother spirit over there, there was something else over here. This drug was especially assertive. We'll see. I mean, these are questions that we can answer with time, and there are ways that they do differ that I think we might expect some slightly different sort of subjective experiences.
I heard that there was research in, I want to say Spain, and I don't remember now who was running this, but they were trying to put people on DMT drips where they would stay in the DMT experience for like hours, with the idea that they wanted people to be able to come back and map it out, essentially.
Oh,
which part of me was like, how could you consent to hours in a DMT trip? I don't know how you would do that, but I thought that was a fascinating concept.
Crazy.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard about that at all. I mean, I think what's so interesting about DMT in part is it's, it's extremely intense, but also short-lived, right? Like, you're just blasted to another dimension, but then you return so quickly you almost can't quite make sense of what you've just experienced. And I can't imagine what that would be like for people with an extended experience. Though, I mean, ayahuasca is orally active DMT. So you kind of know the answer to that question. I mean, same with 5-MeO DMT, the toad venom. That, from what I've read, sounds extraordinarily intense and odd and different. In Michael Pollan's book, it seems to be the one psychedelic substance he really didn't care for at all.
That's funny.
He said that he was just in a white void, just barely hanging on to consciousness by a thread. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I think there's a group in Spain that's been working quite a bit with ayahuasca and producing some really cool results. I think the first double-blind trial of a psychedelic for depression came from Spain in a study of ayahuasca, and results are really impressive. Now, ayahuasca also contains an MAO inhibitor, so one could question: is it the MAO inhibitor, which we know works for depression, or is it the DMT? And I know that they've done some work with, I think, 2CB, if you're familiar with that.
It's not directly, but I know of it.
One of Sasha Shulgin's creations. I'll just say as an aside, my own sense now from doing some research here and understanding the literature is those 2C compounds may not sort of confer the same benefit that the others do. I used to think maybe they were all pretty much doing the same thing, but I think they differ in meaningful ways.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
Not as effective for transformation.
They seem to have some amphetamine-like qualities, and I'm not sure that they really benefit people the same way that psilocybin or LSD or ayahuasca might, or peyote, which we really haven't talked about at all. Have you had any experiences with peyote?
Actually, here in Alabama.
Oh, you have?
Yeah.
Oh.
There's a guy that started a Native American church out in Warrior.
Oh, yeah, I know Chris.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
So he's working with peyote. Huh. That's interesting. I mean, you talk about political environment. I mean, I know Chris fairly well, and I was amazed when I first got to know him that he was doing what he was doing and he wasn't arrested.
He's so transparent, yeah.
I even told him, you're going to get arrested. And he was going down to the police department and saying, this is what we're doing, just so you know. These are the drugs I have. And I was like, Chris, you're going to get arrested. I can't believe you're doing this. And every time I see him, I'd say, I can't believe you haven't been arrested. What in the world is going on? I still don't understand how he hasn't. I don't want him to be.
Yeah.
For the record,
yeah,
but I don't know what he's doing, but
He's got a vision for changing the laws, and he's pretty. I know they've had some trouble with some people in their community on the legal side, but it's never actually come to anything. It's just like been messing with people and making their life hard and making them have to pay a lot in like court fees and stuff. But none of it sticks because the protections of the Native American church are legit under the federal government.
Yeah, I know that the Oclaveha Native American Church is sort of it's a branch of the Native American Church. It's not the kind of traditional mainstream Native American Church, but I think as Chris explained, there was some Utah Supreme Court ruling that essentially ruled in favor of that church, and I would guess that the district attorneys just don't really want to go there.
I think so. His faith is huge, and so I think it's people don't want to mess with that.
He's a kind, loving,
yeah,
sweet, good man.
Yeah. Do you mind if I ask if you have direct experiences?
I'm laughing because that's probably or I'm smiling, I should say, because that's the most common question that I get. And, unfortunately, we don't answer that question either way. And let me explain why. If I were to say yes, then the detractors would say, okay, you have no objectivity. Right, you've had this experience. You're convinced it's going to provide for others what it did for you, and also you broke the law. You are an employee of a public university, and you broke the law, and you've just admitted to breaking the law. Okay, I could say no, and then those who are sort of part of that psychedelic culture community would say, well, you're clueless, and you have no business administering these substances if you don't know personally what that experience is like. This is sort of the track that Charlie Grobe and Roland Griffiths and pretty much everyone involved in this research has taken. Like we've all gotten together and we've wondered, how do you answer this question? Because there doesn't seem to be a way that we can answer it and not sort of end up in hot water. So I think the best answer is to say, we all kind of have an appreciation for spiritual experiences and how they could change and motivate behavior. And we unfortunately can't comment publicly whether we've had that sort of experience, because there's no right way to answer that question. But what's at the bottom of this is important. Could a therapist be administering these drugs, doing research in this area, without any personal experience? And I don't know. There's so many analogies we could use. If you went to see a physician for the treatment of a torn meniscus, would you expect that physician to have had a torn meniscus? Right. Would you feel like he or she could not help you unless they had? Okay, now I realize that's maybe a silly analogy. If we're talking about an experience that is so unlike anything you could imagine, that you feel like it's important that you would have had that yourself to be an effective therapist. But if you're seeking treatment for depression, do you want your therapist to have experienced depression? If you're seeking treatment for alcohol dependence, do you want your therapist to have been alcohol dependent? I think sometimes where these personal experiences can land us in trouble is if we've had an experience very profound to us and we're convinced, okay, this is what the experience is like, because that's what my experience was like, and therefore that's what your experience is going to be like. Let me give you a perfect example of this. One of the early pioneers of psychedelic psychotherapy was Al Hubbard. Have you heard of him? One of the coolest figures you could imagine. You've got to read up on Al Hubbard. Al Hubbard was a Kentucky high school dropout, okay? And he found his way up to Seattle, and he was smuggling things across the border into Canada. And kind of like Catch Me If You Can, the FBI couldn't catch the guy. Very wily and smart. World War II happens. They finally catch him, and they say, hey, we'll wipe the slate clean if you can help us smuggle things to Great Britain via Canada. We need someone with your skill set. He said, okay. In the meantime, he developed a patent for some kind of unique engine that generated him a lot of wealth. But in smuggling things to Great Britain through Canada, he came into contact with members of the Office of Strategic Supplies, which later became the CIA. Right? The CIA, when they learned about LSD, was convinced the Soviets are going to put that in our drinking supply. The Soviets are going to give that to our agents. They're going to use it as a mind control drug. We've got to be ready for this. So if you were in the CIA in the 50s, chances were you were required to have an LSD experience. Wow. Because the idea was when the Soviets catch you, they will give you LSD. You need to be ready for this. So Al knew these guys and came into contact with LSD. Al was a devout Catholic, and he thought, well, this is the beatific vision, right? You see the Virgin Mother, you see Jesus on the cross, all these sort of iconic Orthodox Catholic images. That's what it is. That's what it is. Okay, so the sort of therapeutic model that we use now is in many ways Al Hubbard's. He connected with a guy named Humphrey Osmond and Abraham Hoffer in Canada. He, a lot of the ideas were his. What I didn't mention is we'll often have a flower in the therapy room, and if a participant gets up to use the bathroom, when they come back, we might hand the flower to them and encourage them to look into it. That was Al Hubbard's idea. Encouraging people to look into the artwork, the idea that we're just hoping to encourage them to let go and immerse themselves in the experience. These were Al Hubbard's ideas. So he really pioneered these approaches in many ways. And fascinating character. He'd sort of fly around the continent and trying to introduce LSD to as many influential people as he could. He really felt like this was his calling. Like God called upon him to do this.
Wow.
Anyway, to get to my point, there was a character named Myron Stolaroff, and Myron was raised Jewish, and Al was going to administer LSD to Myron for the first time, and he's putting up in the room statues of Mary and these sort of Catholic icons, and Myron says, "Wait a second, you know I'm Jewish, don't you?" And I was like, "Oh, it doesn't matter. You'll see. This is what it is. That's what it was for me. So it's what it's going to be for you." And apparently Myron had a very bad time. He did not appreciate it. He did not have a good time. Now later he claimed it was beneficial. He was able to take that difficulty and make it a benefit. But like there's the danger in maybe our own experiences coloring so strongly how we do what we do that we see things from a very narrow perspective, that we assume, well, your experience is going to be like mine, as will everyone else's. I think it's better to realize the psychedelic experience can be many different things to many different people. It probably ultimately does touch on the transcendent, which varies from person to person. I am of the opinion that ultimately one thing that will link us all, the one thing that we'd all agree upon is transcendent, bigger than who we are, is our connection to the people we love. So I can almost promise you at some point during an experience for you, you're going to feel connection to your parents, or your siblings, or your significant other, your children, your friends, whomever, the people in your social circles, as will I, as will anybody. But outside of that, I don't really know what you might experience, and chances are there might be something that's just kind of weird and funny, and whimsical, and there's probably a place to that too. Which actually leads me to another question for you. It's kind of interesting how, for a lot of those English musicians, that like whimsy played such an important role in the psychedelic experience. Like that you listen to Sgt. Pepper and Paul really had a lot of whimsy in there. And if you've listened to Pink Floyd's first album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, I mean, they're singing about gnomes and bikes. It's really kind of silly and whimsical, but there's something. Why is whimsy also psychedelic? I don't know. I want to ask an artist, like, what is it about whimsy that's psychedelic?
That's interesting, because one of my biggest prayers when I went into my first ayahuasca ceremonies was to be reconnected to my child self, because I felt like I was like a crazy kid that wore mismatched shoes on my feet, and I was an actor. It was just really just like stuff was coming out of me all the time. And in the process of growing up and becoming an adult, I got cut off from that, and it worked. And I feel like, I think part of the magic that got revealed to me is that literally humans are, it's magical. We have ideas, and then we have bodies that make it manifest in this world. And the realization that I think actually, who's the Apple guy?
Tim Cook. Wait.
No, who found it out with the mock turtlenecks?
Why am I?
You know who I'm talking about.
I do.
Anyway, he said something along the lines of like, once you realize that the world as you perceive it is just the manifestation of other people's ideas and inventions, it just you suddenly step into your own agency of like, well, I want my world to be really playful and funny, and I want to have a good time while I'm here. I want to make other people laugh. Anything that I think I can create.
There's a writer. His name is James Martin. He's a Jesuit also, and he wrote a book I really enjoyed called Between Heaven and Mirth, Mirth. And he sort of argues that that in the Christian tradition, at least, there's this idea that these well-known religious figures, these saints, were very serious and they never smiled, always very stoic, and there's something about religion that's supposed to be very stoic and serious. But if you really take a closer look at the evidence that we have, they were silly, and they were constantly cracking jokes, and they're pranksters. And I guess the idea is if you truly have this sort of zest for life and you're really happy, you see a lot of humor in a lot of different things, including like the mundane. Like suddenly, a silly little song about a troll is really kind of funny, and why take things so seriously? Like life really isn't that serious. And maybe there's something about that psychedelic experience too that teaches us, you're here to be happy, you're here to have fun, and don't take everything so seriously. And sometimes you can see humor in the most mundane sort of things, and sing a little song about turning 64, and it's funny.
And that's how you change people too. Like that's how you touch people, is through humor and through the unexpected. It's not through lecturing somebody. That's not what we remember.
We said through the unexpected. Yeah. And I think humor is often about the unexpected. And the psychedelic experience is about the unexpected. Like, surprise, surprise, look at that. So I guess how can you walk away from that not sort of finding things a little funnier than you did before?
Totally. Yeah.
Oh. Well. Anyway, thank you for answering the question.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah,
I'm so grateful that because I know you do a lot in your work to communicate to the world what you're up to, and you're a great speaker, and I'm really grateful that you do that. And
how cool is it that you're here?
Yeah.
Lucky me. Feel free to stop by again anytime.
Cool. Thank you. I will. Oh, where can people find you?
I mean, I have a Twitter account, but I don't really do anything with it.
Okay.
I was told, I should have one. I think the university would like us to have one, but I don't really have a whole lot to say. I sometimes tweet out a study that I think is interesting. I think it's at PS Hendricks.
Awesome. Cool.
There you go.
Thank you for listening, and thank you for sharing these stories. I've gotten messages from many of you that you've been sending out these voices from teachers and guides to people that are seeking direction in these really confusing, frustrating, sometimes scary times. And I thank you all for sharing whatever wisdom has come through into your life that's been helpful. People hear different voices, and to Peter's point, while some grandmas will definitely only go to the hospital and to the doctors in the lab coats, there are some that will also definitely go to the underground ceremonies, which I know because I've sat with them before. So I just want to encourage you to keep sharing your experiences, particularly if you're in a position where it's safe to do so in your life. You're not jeopardizing, your work. Your signal will be picked up by the seekers who need to find it. And as simple as it sounds, your transparency can be a really life-changing gift for people who feel really alone and not sure where to turn. And for the ones that aren't looking and listening, we hold them with love and wish them healing on their path, and pray that the guides and teachers who they can hear will appear before them and shine the light on whatever they do need. We are one another's greatest resources, so please make your experience and your voice available. Plant those seeds everywhere you go. I love you all. You can find me on the internet, maurajames.com and Maura James on Instagram, and I'm running my fundraising campaign for 2 more weeks for the film that I'm making about life after prison. So please check that out online, Surviving America on Indiegogo, if you haven't already. I'm really grateful for all of your support. It truly means so much, and also means that a film will be made. So thank you.
Sera bot so na yin fara la no sakata sakki la punu zu faman homba
Hallelujah.